So we thought about how it's possible to mark ourselves in a good way. But of course, the Bible also says it's possible to mark ourselves in a bad way as well. Now, the New Testament speaks about something that's going to happen at the end of time. The Bible says that Jesus is going to come back again for all those who belong to him. And that's really great news. If we've trusted in Jesus, if we love Jesus, Jesus is coming back for those who belong to him. But just before Jesus comes back, the Bible warns us that some pretty terrible things are going to happen. There's going to be a person on the earth called the Beast. Now, we're not quite sure who he is or what form he's going to take. But he's going to be a false prophet. And he's going to lead the world astray, the Bible says. And he's going to serve the devil. And he's going to force everybody to have a mark put on themselves, either on their head or on their hand, to show that they belong to him. Let me read this verse to you from Revelation. All people were forced to put a mark on their right hand or forehead, whether they were powerful or weak, rich or poor, free people or slaves. They all had to have this mark, or else they could not buy or sell anything. This mark stood for the name of the beast. Do you think it's a good idea to have that mark put on you? Some say yes, some say no. Well, we'll see. I'll answer that question a bit later on, but before we answer that question, I want to tell you a story this morning, and hopefully this story will give you an answer, give you an idea as to what the answer is. So our story today, before I show you the first picture, it's about a king. And this king lived in a lovely palace, and the palace was a beautiful palace, and the thing that the king loved more than anything else was to sit on his deck of the palace and look out at the wonderful view. Okay, do you ever like to do that? Do you ever like to see a nice, beautiful view? Should we see what his view was like as he sat on his deck of his palace? This was the view that he had. Okay, so you can look out. What do we see in the view here? What have we got here? Yeah, we've got some trees down the front here, and there's some sea there, there's some islands in the sea, isn't there? It's a lovely, beautiful place. The king loved his view, and what he also loved was trees. So he had all these different trees brought in from different parts of the world. So you can see right at the end there's a lovely big English oak tree, and then there's a fir tree that he brought in from Canada, and there's some lovely poplar trees here that he got from France. There's some palm trees that he got from the West Indies. And there's one of these cypress trees that he got from Monterey, just down the road there. So the king loved his trees and he loved his view. But when he planted these trees, there were two other trees that he planted as well. Somebody said to him, here, try these two trees here. You'll like these two. So these two trees grew up very straight and very tall. And the king thought, well, they're nice trees. I like those. So they grew up very straight and very tall. But the problem is that when all the other trees had finished growing, these two trees hadn't finished growing. And the problem was, they just got bigger and bigger. Okay. In fact, they got so big they filled up my page, haven't they? What do you think the king thought about these two trees? What do you think the king thought about it? Well, the other trees were great, they're just for smaller trees. What do you think he thought about these two big trees? Yeah, Jane. They're covering his view, aren't they? Exactly. Remember we said at the beginning, the thing he loved more than anything else was his view. And so one day he decides to have a chat with his gardener. And so he goes down to the foot of these trees, he's walking about, and he's talking to his gardener about the fact that he hasn't got his good view anymore. Now the two trees, they overhear this, these two tall trees. They can hear what the king's saying. And so they can't quite hear everything he's saying, but one of the trees says to the other one, the king's talking about his view. And I've heard two things mentioned. He's talked about his view, and he's talked about the carpenter coming along. He says, I know what the king's going to do. The king is going to build a nice viewing platform at the top of us trees, so he can look out and have his view, not just as it was, but even better than it was. So the two trees, they start to boast about how tall and how grand and how majestic they are. And not only that, they start to mock all the other smaller trees by saying the King has chosen us to build his viewing platform in, because we're the biggest, we're the tallest, we're the most important. And then the next day, the gardener comes along and he puts a little mark on these two trees. See a little mark down here at the bottom? Do you see the mark? What's the mark on the bottom there? Do you see it? A little X, a little white X was painted on the two trees. And some of the other trees start to complain. They say, well, why can't the King build his viewing platform in us? We want to have an X painted on us as well, because we want to be part of this. We've been here just as long as these other trees. But the old oak tree, who's the wisest of the trees, he says to the other trees, don't be in a hurry to get a mark put on you. Don't be in a hurry to get one of these white X's painted on you, because you don't always know what's going to happen. Well, the next day, the carpenter comes along, and the two tall trees are very excited about the viewing platform that's going to be built inside them. And so one of them looks down, he says, the carpenter's here, the carpenter's here. And as he looks down, the other one says, why hasn't the carpenter got any wood with him? And the other thinks, I don't know, because surely he needs some wood to build the viewing platform in our branches. And then the other one says, as I'm looking down at the carpenter, he's only got one tool with him. What one tool do you think the carpenter might have had with him, Alex? An axe. You're not wrong. It was an axe. And suddenly, instead of building a viewing platform, these trees suddenly realise far too late that they're being chopped down. Dear, that's not good, is it? They were so excited about having an X painted on them because they thought that means that the King favours us and he's going to do something special for us. But actually, having an X painted on you just meant that you were going to get chopped down. Suddenly all the other trees were grateful that they hadn't had an X painted on them after all. Now, remember we spoke earlier about the people at the end of time who are going to have a mark put on them. Do you think it would be a good idea for those people to have a mark put on them after all? No, it won't be, because it shows that they won't belong to God. Remember we spoke last week, for those who are here, the marks we can put upon ourselves show that we belong to God. Well, we're not sure when this is all going to happen. We're not going to sure if it's going to happen in our lifetime. We're not going to sure what this mark even looks like. But I think the message that God is saying to us is this. Don't mark yourselves, not just on your body, but in your heart and in your mind. Don't mark yourselves with things that show that you don't belong to God. Because it's possible to mark ourselves with things that show that we're the enemies of God. By the things we say, by the things we do, by the jealousy we might have in our heart, by the things we join, by the organisations we want to be a part of. We can show that we actually don't really care about God. And God says, be very careful about what you say yes to. Be very careful about what kind of marks you put upon your heart and what kind of marks you put upon your mind. Because the only mark that God's looking for is the mark that we spoke about last week, where we trust in Jesus Christ. And we ask that his death on the cross pays for our sins. We pray that you would keep us and guard us and protect us from all these other things. Help us, we pray. Amen.